One of the things I'm really excited about is DW Books, the fact that we are putting out books that other people truly will not put out. One of them that is out, came out earlier this month. I think it's already on one of the bestseller lists at Amazon. Is by Julio Rosas, who is a senior writer for Town Hall and was on the ground at the center of the most severe riots we've had in years and years. He has written a book called Fiery but Mostly Peaceful, The 2020 Riots and the Gaslighting of America. Here's a clip for the book. This is cut 105.
The media gaslit the American people for all of 2020 as the riots unfolded. They did not give you the full story. I was there. George Floyd, Kyle Rittenhouse, Ray Sharp Books, Chaz in Seattle. I saw all the riots with my own eyes. Windshields being smashed, giant rocks that were being thrown, businesses that were starting to be looted. The crowd started to become hostile. All the cops were trapped and surrounded. Police were being ordered to retreat. I experienced the tear gas, I experienced the smoke. This was very real to me. The mainstream media, they were trying to call them protests. CNN with that chyron saying fiery but mostly peaceful. They're trying to push a narrative of don't believe your lying eyes because they were trying to appease a very dedicated Antifa movement that's there. When you read my book, Fiery but Mostly Peaceful, you will get the full story. You will learn what actually happened during the riots of 2020 and what the media did not want to tell you. Buy my book, Fiery but Mostly Peaceful, everywhere books are sold.
The book is Fiery but Mostly Peaceful, The 2020 Riots and the Gaslighting of America. The author is Julio Rosas, senior writer for Town Hall. Julio, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
So were you, in fact, at Town Hall when this story first broke?
Yes, I joined Town Hall in late 2019. And the quick funny story behind that is I'd covered some protests earlier. And so when they said, well, what do you want to do at Town Hall? I said, well, I can do the daily stuff. But whenever there's protests or riots breaking out, I want to go travel. And then 2020 happened. And so we really got our full money's worth out of that deal.
Where were you when you heard that George Floyd had died, that this was becoming a thing?
So I was in Los Angeles. I was with family since this was still, the early days of the COVID lockdowns, and I didn't want to be in the DC area. There's no point. So I decided to visit family. And so I was actually late to seeing the video of George Floyd and what happened to him because my being on different time zones and operating on Eastern time while I was on the West Coast doesn't really bode too well for me. So I woke up that morning actually kind of late. And by the time I saw Twitter, and it was already, the main thing. And I realized that there was going to be some reaction to it for obvious reasons. But I didn't think, I thought because of COVID that it wasn't going to be anywhere near as to what actually happened. But obviously that wasn't the case.
Where did you go first? Where did you go to cover the story?
So I went right to Minneapolis, and it was I got there. So the video of George Floyd went viral on Monday, and I got there on the ground by Thursday, and it was insane how basically the basic tenets of what we know to be just a civilized society, especially in the country, was just not there. When I got to the neighborhood where the 3rd Precinct is located, where Derek Chauvin and the other officers were based out of, the neighborhood was just in complete chaos. But it was not to say that it was controlled chaos, but because it was during the day and people get more active at night, it was just people were just doing whatever they wanted throughout because there was no cops, because they were all holed up trying to protect the 3rd Precinct from being burned down.
So what were they doing? What were the protesters doing?
Well, so there were 3 kind of distinct groups. The first group was just dedicated to just protesting right outside the 3rd Precinct, and that was actually peaceful. They were angry. They were hostile in a sense, but they didn't do anything during the daylight hours. And then right across the street there was that strip mall that had a Target, that had a grocery store, and several other small businesses, and they were being just looted throughout the day. Some people were cleaning up the mess from the night before, but it was just people were just doing whatever they wanted, and people were trying to actually do violence, trying to commit violence against the officers. But there were people within the crowd at that point stopping them. But as day turned into night, those people left, the peaceful people left, and a whole new group kind of came in, and the night's events unfolded. And that was the night when they were ordered to evacuate from the 3rd Precinct, and it was set on fire.
So you're standing there. People are looting. Other people, the decent folks, are trying to keep people from going absolutely bats. And the cops nowhere in sight?
No, like I said, they were just mainly holed up. At least in that immediate vicinity, they were just holed up in the building because going out was not really an option, just because there were so many people who were out on the street, and also because the one time that there were officers who came into the crowd because someone had gotten stabbed, and so they went in to arrest the person and try to get the person who got stabbed medical attention. But that's when things became a little violent during the day, because they were trying to, they said that they didn't want the police officers to take away the stabbing victim. They wanted an ambulance to come in, and the cops had to tell the crowd the ambulance isn't coming because you guys are being violent. They're not going to risk their lives doing that, which again was kind of shocking to hear at how, when you call 911 for an ambulance in this country, you expect an ambulance to show up, right? So it's just there was no police presence outside of that building.
Were the people who were protesting, the people who were angrily protesting, were they trying to stop the looting and the violence at all? Or were they just disconnected from it? No. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So now night falls. What happens then?
I mean, it just people were there had been a fencing that kind of similar to what's been put up around the Supreme Court and the Capitol buildings. Similar, not exactly, but there had a fence was erected around the precinct the day before, and so people started to shake the fence down, and they actually were successful in tearing it down towards the front of the building. And then that's when cops came out on top of the roof to fire tear gas and rubber bullets at people to get them to stop. And then that's just crescendoed from there. The rioters were going around the entire building and taking the fencing down in other places. So it became very, very quickly apparent that the defensive position within the officers became very untenable. They didn't have the manpower. They didn't have presumably the ammunition for crowd control needed to get people to stop, because people were very, very angry. And there had been multiple times throughout that part of the night where I had heard people trying they were vocally stating that they wanted to set the building on fire with the officers still inside. And that's when I realized that this was going to be, very, very bad in some way. Now, obviously that didn't happen because the order for them to evacuate came before that. But even then, as they were evacuating, they were being attacked the whole way out. And someone actually, they couldn't open the fence because someone had jammed the fence. And so they had to take one of the police cars and drive through it to get it to open so that they can get all the vehicles out along with the people. So this was very violent. People were intending to kill all the officers inside through arson if they were given the chance. And the mayor, Jacob Frey, he said that he gave the order, but the problem with them evacuating and just letting, now there's 0 police officers in the area, was that sure, they set the building on fire, but they weren't satisfied with that. They didn't go home. They achieved their main objective, but they wanted to continue. And then that's when we saw other buildings that weren't police buildings being set on fire. And there was the 5th precinct, which is a straight shot west down the street about 3 miles, and they wanted to continue to burn that police station down. It just dominoed from that. And so when people say that, oh, well, it was because when I posted that video of the building being on fire and officers retreating, people were celebrating, saying, yes, this is justice for George Floyd. This is what we wanted to have happened. But what they didn't realize is that the rioters, they weren't satisfied with that. They wanted to continue their rampage.
Well, was your impression, you may not know the answer to this, it would be understandable if you didn't, but was it your impression that the people who were doing this, the people who were really at the core of the violence, were neighborhood people? Or do you think that they had come from elsewhere?
It seemed like a mix, for sure. There were, like I said, there were people during the day who were expressing concern about people coming in from outside of the city or maybe from the surrounding neighborhood. neighborhoods and causing disruptions, because they said that if they become violent, then those people, they don't have to suffer the consequences, because the people then get to go home and leave, while the members of the community have to suffer the consequences of their actions. But I mean, this was a very diverse crowd. It was people from all ages and all races and what have you. So it's hard to definitively say 60% were from the neighborhood or not. But I think it just seemed like there were a lot of Minnesotans there for sure.
Okay, so how many days were you there?
I was there from Thursday to Monday, so about 3 or 4 days.
And did it get worse, better during that time?
So the next day, Friday, the police did set up a perimeter around after they finally cleared everybody out and everyone went home. This is a more accurate description. But no, it continued, and so they once again tried to, the rioters pushed the law enforcement line all the way back away from the 3rd precinct down towards the 5th precinct. And this was the first night where they're going to try to enforce a curfew. And it was absolutely unsuccessful. I mean, there was no attempt to really to enforce that, no really attempt to stop people from targeting other things. They were able to prevent the 5th precinct from being overrun because the National Guard was out in full force, the state police were out in full force, which was not the case on Thursday. So it wasn't until Thursday and Friday was really the crescendo for Minneapolis, and I mean even St. Paul, who had largely been spared the chaos in the days prior. Thursday was when things started to get out of control over there. So I mean, really, that's what's kind of unique about Minneapolis, was that it wasn't just Minneapolis; it was also nearby St. Paul, right across the way from that. So I mean, it was pretty just shocking to see that, again, 2 major American cities were just thrown into complete chaos, and there were a lot of mistakes clearly on the state's end, the city's end, to try to quell this craziness.
We're talking to Julio Rosas, the author of the new book, Fiery but Mostly Peaceful, the 2020 Riots and the Gaslighting of America. At what point did you start to realize that the coverage of this on TV was markedly different than what you were seeing?
Oh, well, there was Ali Velshi, MSNBC, who was on the ground in Minneapolis. And I remember seeing him. That Thursday. Now, of course, obviously I wasn't, listening to him because I was out covering the hecticness that was out there. But it wasn't until I then got back to my hotel room and I saw the clips on Twitter of him saying that this is not, generally speaking, an unruly protest, but fires haven't started as an entire building is burning behind it. And I'm just thinking, what in the world? I'm like, how can you say that? It's one thing if it's an anchor in the studio saying that, but how can you say that when you're literally there? But even before that, Craig Melvin, again at MSNBC, or he was at MSNBC at the time, he tweeted out basically what their style guide was. And they were saying that we're not going to call these riots. We're going to mostly focus on the protests. And there's some acts of violence that's happening, and then the whole buildings are going up in flames. I mean, it was absurd. I mean, so literally, right out the gate, and of course that's not surprising, right? Because who was the BLM movement, and you can't criticize them, or else you're labeled immediately a racist. And so right away I knew that was going to be a part of the story. What I didn't really realize was just how consistent they were going to be, just because I didn't anticipate riots to continue. I initially thought, okay, I'll go to Minneapolis, cover a few days craziness, and then I'll go back, and then things will go back to normal in the sense that we'll be back to focusing on COVID and the presidential election. But clearly that wasn't the case. They kept happening, and I didn't set out to write a book at the very beginning. I didn't think I would even write a book, period. But as they continued, and then as the media continued to cover for them and play defense for them, that's why I wanted to put out a physical medium of oral history, essentially, because the people who have bigger platforms, because the people who are supposed to be reportedly acting on these things weren't. And so this is to say, no, here's what actually happened.
Do you ever get a chance to talk to any of the other reporters?
A few. I mean, there were not necessarily the mainstream reporters, with the exception being Fox News, Mike Tobin, who I've gotten to know. He's a great guy. He's a great reporter. But I mean, the other reporters that I became friends with were not from mainstream media. I was people from the Daily Caller, from the Blaze, independent, just straight up independent people and live streamers, because we were always out there. We were traveling the country, and we would try to stay together, kind of a safety in numbers aspect, because these were violent situations that we're throwing ourselves in, and we didn't have the backing of these large, super large mainstream media outlets and all the resources that those entities can provide. So we all just did this just because we enjoyed the work for what it was, and also just because people were really relying on us to give them the facts in real time, because they weren't getting it from the usual suspects.
So is your impression that, how can I put this? Is your impression that these mainstream media guys were acting cooperatively with one another? Because I was a reporter, I covered big stories, and the competition was so intense that people were actually hitting each other to get the story before the other people, but these guys seemed to be acting in unison. It was kind of different. What was your impression of why this big lie was managing to take over so much of the coverage?
I don't think necessarily it's coordination between them. I think it's just that the market and the environment is just so saturated with, admittedly, just left-wing individuals, and so they see no problem. And we see this all the time with, for example, whenever there's an effort to highlight businesses and business owners being suffering the consequences of these riots, because there's a reflex saying, well, it's just property, there's insurance and all that. And it's because they truly believe that there's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with rioters targeting a building because, well, it's just a building. It's not a human life. And so I think it's just that there's a whole bunch of ideologues within the mainstream media, and they don't just see an issue with that just because that's what their personal beliefs are. And then therefore it bleeds into their coverage. And it's really absurd. I mean, one of the examples I provide in the book is from the New York Times. And it was talking about how Republicans were whatabouting January 6th with the 2020 riots. But in that same article, they were downplaying the riots because the sentence was Republicans are highlighting isolated instances of property damage during the BLM protests. And we're talking $2 billion worth of damage over many months. A lot of people were killed during this. A lot more people have been killed in the crime wave that was due in part because of the riots. I mean, and so to reduce all of that to just that, isolated instance of property damage is just obscene. It's ahistorical and it's irresponsible. But because that's what they believe, they're more than happy to have that be the narrative.
Minneapolis looked like, Minneapolis used to be a beautiful city. It looked like it was in ruins from the pictures that I saw.
It absolutely was. South Minneapolis, which, unfortunately was also the minority heavy area of the city, was very, very damaged. And one of the stories that is in the book about, the people had to take up arms to defend themselves and their property and their businesses. And they weren't white people. There were, in this one man that I interviewed, he was Latino, and a whole bunch of other Latinos. There were rooftop Latinos instead of rooftop Koreans from the 92 Los Angeles riots in 92. But they had to do that because there was no help. No one was coming to save them. And if they didn't do that, then their own businesses probably wouldn't have survived. So and that's the other kind of interesting parts when people are justifying these riots because, the ends justify the means. It's like, well, you're also hurting the very community that you're saying that you're advocating for. And it's not just, we see this all the time, like with the border crisis, which I've covered extensively. People say, well, the reason why Biden's approach is better is because it's more safe and humane. It's, well, no, you're actually harming the migrants more because you're encouraging them to put themselves in the hands of dangerous drug cartels and dangerous parts of Mexico. So, we see this all the time within the left wing where they say, well, we're the champion of X, but in order to achieve that, we're going to hurt that same demographic. but it's, to me, it's even worse when we have entire communities on fire or destroyed. And that was certainly the case in Minneapolis because it was predominantly in the minority neighborhoods.
I got to stop you there. Really interesting. Thank you, Julio Rosas. The book is Fiery but Mostly Peaceful, The 2020 Riots and the Gaslighting of America. Really interesting talking to you, Julio. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
For more great content, like and subscribe to The Andrew Klavan Show wherever you get your podcasts.